So welcome to the Climate Teacher Ed webinar hosted by the Institute of Science and Math Education at the University of Washington in Seattle. I'm Deb Morrison, a research scientist at the Institute and a climate justice learning design advisor. I'll be co-moderating the discussion today along with my colleague, Philip Bell, a professor in the College of Ed.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today, especially with everything going on that might have otherwise taken your time. This webinar is a new activity of an effort that's called the Climate Teacher Ed Collaborative that we've recently launched. The Collaborative is a teacher ed initiative dedicated to helping future teachers learn to engage youth in community climate justice projects and to civically engage in response to the climate crisis. And so this is, we're excited. It's our third webinar as we open up these monthly excursions in different directions. And we talk with different experts who help us think about what teacher ed might and should look like from that goal.
Thank you. We hope this webinar series will be a valuable resource for teacher educators and educators in general to focus on instruction, learning, teaching design to just responses to the climate crisis. We encourage you to check out the professional learning resources we share through the climate learning section of the STEMteachingtools.org website. It's a new tab across the top of the website, and we've clustered resources in that area. So for those of you joining us live today, please post questions for the presenters into the Q&A function in Zoom. You're welcome to share your thoughts and resources over chat, and we'll collect those resources and make sure that they're part of our products on that climate learning page for everyone to benefit from. Today, I'm joining in from Southern California, but normally I am on the unceded and ancestral and current homelands and territories of the Salish peoples on Stayas and Pender Island, British Columbia, Canada.
And the University of Washington, where I work, and on the lands where I live, these are the lands of the Shutsi-speaking peoples, who identify as the Duwamish, Suquamish, Snoqualmie, Puyallup, and Muckleshoot peoples. As we hold that in focus, we want to recognize their ongoing and historic stewardship of these lands and waters and airs in right relation to all living things here, and just recognize that upholding tribal sovereignty certainly includes to matters of educational sovereignty, especially around matters of climate and environment like we're talking about today. So welcome, and we hope you'll spend some time learning about kind of the tribal context and histories in which you live as well. We're so thrilled to have Lindsey Kirkland joining us today, so welcome.
Lindsey will be sharing the fascinating and important work that Climate Generation is engaging with. They are a nonprofit organization, and Lindsey will tell us all about them. Their work centers around the idea that communities collectively hold the power to innovate and demand climate change solutions. They focus on empowering individuals in their communities to make long-term lasting change by building climate literacy, understanding personal connections to climate change, and developing powerful advocates through a model of collaboration and partnership. Near and dear to my own heart, Lindsey. All right.
Yeah, so we were expecting to have Lindsey's colleague, Kristen Poppleton, here today. She's the Senior Director of Programs for Climate Generation. Unfortunately, she just wasn't able to make it and apologizes for her absence. Kristen, in addition to her work at Climate Gen, is a board member for the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network, what many of us know of as the CLEAN Network, working in climate science ed.
Lindsey herself, didn't know if I said your last name already. Lindsey Kirkland is the Senior Climate Change Education Manager, and she supports climate change education programs for K-12 educators. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Environment, Conservation, and Fisheries Sciences from the University of Washington, Seattle, just saying, representing there. And distracted now, Master's of Education in Science Education from Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. So you kind of have the climate education powerhouses states in your repertoire there, Lindsey. Lindsey is an adjunct faculty in Hamline University and supported the development of their climate literacy certificate. She's an active member in the CLEAN Network as well, and in the Clean Energy Education Summit, so CEES. All right.
Welcome, Lindsey. Excited to have you here.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Deb. Thanks, audience members. I'm excited to be here today.
So as is our tradition, we wanted to start with a broad framing question, just about how you and your colleagues at Climate Generation kind of define community climate justice education. What does it look like?
Thanks for that question. And before I dive in, before I share my screen too, I'd like to just acknowledge that Climate Generation's office resides on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe and Dakota peoples. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. You can give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Cool. Thanks. So Climate Generation, a little bit about us before I jump in again, is our mission is to catalyze communities to make long-term lasting climate change solutions. And we understand that climate change is an intersectional issue because we see the impacts are connected with race, gender, income, and other socioeconomic identities. We believe just and equitable solutions cannot be found if we proceed with climate science or policy alone. And we must take a comprehensive perspective of climate change impacts and solutions if we're going to reach these goals and create a future where we want to live. And these are our 3 strategic pillars, just so you have a better sense of where we see ourselves going. I don't think we're at this point yet, but we hope to overcome disinformation, center anti-racism and systemic equity, and personalize and localize climate change action. And Climate Generation was founded in 2006 after polar explorer Will Steger's eyewitness account of climate change in the Arctic. You might have heard of Will. Will brought his story back to Minnesota after his experience in the Arctic, and he actually was able to move a community of educators, politicians, and climate change communicators to action with his eyewitness account. And I'd like to provide some sort of broad and personal context to what was happening at Climate Generation as we emerged as a leader. And I'm going to share a personal story with you to do this. So around this time, in 2006, I was in my first year of undergrad at University of Washington. I was completely unaware of Will and his story. In fact, I didn't learn about climate change probably until my 2nd or 3rd year in college. And I don't want to discredit the biology department at UW. So I'll admit I probably had heard about climate change in some extent in my science classes before that, but I probably didn't learn about the human dimensions of climate change, like the fact that people caused it, our health is impacted by it, and that we have a responsibility to fix it, really until my 3rd year. And I grew up in a predominantly Republican community in a southern state with an education system that taught intelligent design and never talked about climate change. So, I mean, I just can't imagine a student today going that long until they were 22 without hearing or learning about climate change. And that just shouldn't happen. And it still does today. When I graduated in 2009, Climate Generation was 3 years old. An Inconvenient Truth had just came out. A coalition of federal partners had recently developed some climate literacy principles. And the IPCC, for their 4th assessment report, was just released, which was sort of the beginning of like acknowledging serious effects of warming were becoming evident in our daily lives. And actually at that time, nearly 50% of the US adults believed in climate change and were concerned about its impacts. In the education world, climate change related benchmarks and the standards were being revised under the guise of academic freedom, which actually allowed educators to teach to the controversy of climate change, skirting around the fact that there was mounting evidence that climate change was real and it was caused by people. And we're actually still seeing the effects of these bills in different states today. In the 15 years since that, we have made huge strides in changing the way we communicate about climate change. And we've actually been able to increase public acceptance of anthropogenic climate change. 70% of US adults now believe in climate change and are concerned about it. And we've actually ushered in some amazing solution-centered work. The next generation science standards, which you might be familiar with, they heavily feature climate change, and they've been published and adopted or accepted in 44 states. And in very, very recent years, we're starting to see the connection between science, education, and social justice. And it's becoming a regular feature in media and more accepted in a widespread sense in our education system. And I share this narrative with you because I believe that if we don't stop and reflect on all the good work that is happening right now, it's hard to feel like we're making any progress. And I always want to start with a mission and a sense of hope. We are doing the work and it's happening. So climate generation believes that climate change education and climate change is an intersectional issue that requires holistic and interdisciplinary education. One that teaches the complexity of the climate system and investigates the political, economic, and social systems that influence the impacts and solutions. So we should always be founding this work in science research, but it shouldn't end there. And to create a working definition of climate justice education.
Lindsay, can I pop in?
Yeah.
Sorry, slides aren't advancing, I don't think.
Yep,
So.
no, it's okay. I think
okay, you're good.
I'm like staying in one slide for a long time. I appreciate
Excellent.
that.
All right.
Yeah.
No, excellent. My apologies.
No worries. So to create a working definition, climate generation weaves in aspects of social justice and teaching from the climate justice movement to the climate literacy principles. So thinking about solutions, and I've used that term solutions a few times, I just want to make sure that we have a grounding in like what definitions we're using for that. So when I mention climate solutions, in part, I'm referring to the mitigative and adaptive solutions or climate change actions that we take. And climate change mitigation means avoiding and reducing emissions of heat trapping gases. And adaptions means adapting to life in a changing climate. So that involves adjusting to the actual or expected future climate. And the goal there being to reduce people's vulnerability to the harmful effects of climate change everywhere. And this applies specifically to those that are impacted first and worst, both globally and within our own communities. In my opinion, climate adaptation and mitigation are sort of constrained by the inertia of our global and regional trends in economic development, greenhouse gas emissions, resource consumptions, among other things. And those systems that we have in place just aren't nimble enough to adapt to the needs of communities at the pace at which climate change requires. And so they don't really provide the solutions that are widely available and accessible to everyone. And to strengthen communities and center the dynamic and effective solutions that already exist in community, climate generation believes that we should be working in collaboration with these communities at the front lines of climate change. And to do this, we believe we need to move away from our systems, which are founded on white supremacy and racism. My work brings us to schools. Schools are the centers for community connection and living laboratories of learning. They're part of both the built and social systems that perpetuate climate change. They are therefore part of the solutions as well. And they have the capacity to address issues of racial oppression, economic suppression, and other forms of social marginalization that are exacerbated by climate change. And we believe that teachers are trusted messengers of climate literacy, and you have the power to create and support climate change solutions, especially building efficacy and empowerment in your students. So schools that center community-based practices, in these schools that actually live up to this community-based practices, teachers can support students by integrating community organizing and base building, by fostering development of green skills that connect to career pathways and inspire civic engagement. And for the purposes of this conversation, as we lead into the rest of the time today, I feel like it might be helpful for me to give you like a really solid definition here. Firstly, centering on what is climate justice. And this comes from our work from the Youth Environmental Activist Program at Climate Generation. And their definition that showed up in a climate justice education bill recently in Minnesota legislature is climate justice is a framework that puts people first and views the effects of climate change as interconnected with forms of oppression, connecting climate change to social and economic justice issues. So if I take that and go one step further and provide you with my definition of community-centered climate justice education, I would say this. I would say it's a framework that works to make climate justice a reality. And it does that by following pedagogies that center student voice, power, and experience, creating anti-racist schools, providing educators and administrators the support to do the personal work and to become anti-racist themselves, and leveraging a collaborative approach to design. And go ahead, Deb. I don't know if there are
Yeah.
follow-up questions to that.
Yeah, I think there's a number of different things to sort of poke on here and probe. When we think about these pedagogical commitments, you talk a lot about collaboration. So can you, and this community-centered collaboration. So can you expand a little bit what that type of pedagogical commitment means in practice?
Yeah, I think, again, my context the way I put this work into my work is different than what other folks might. But when I think of collaboration or community-centeredness, I think of ground up approaches within the extent to which our work allows us to do that, right? And I'll give a very grounded example of this with our Summer Institute in just a few minutes. But rather than thinking about an individual being the owner of knowledge, we think about knowledge being created as a collective that reflects our own cultural understandings, our prior conceptions about concepts, and our desires for learning and how we implement that into our lives. And if we start with the individuals in our experience and bring that out and bring those stories out into the learning space, I think that we can get to this work of building collective understanding in education.
And part of the work that you're doing in collaboration, you named as trusted messengers. That idea of trusted messenger is a very specific idea in your theory of social change. Can you unpack that a little bit? Where is that coming from, and what are these trusted messengers?
Yeah, again, definitely contextual. Excuse me. I believe educators hold a space in the community as leaders. Educators might always feel valued in that way, especially right now, being on the receiving end of some hardship and trauma during COVID and, just the way life is right now. But folks look up to educators, and educators have a very unique ability to meet students where they need to be met. And in my mind, good education requires trust and relational interactions, and it's not based on transactions of information. And so having that trust and that relationship allows folks to have vulnerability and a sense of understanding and empathy in the way that they teach or communicate. And so it allows for a real deep change in practice, or a really deep change in the way that we understand the world.
Mm-hmm. It's great. I mean, that idea has so many deep groundings in both communication and pedagogical spaces. Tony Leiserowitz and Ed Mabeck's work in communication of trusted messengers. And then I would say, Megan Bang and Kyle White's work in relational pedagogies, and others who have worked in these types of justice, Danny Morales Doyle, Alexis Patterson, around these relational pedagogies. So thank you very much for making those connections in this work. Maybe Phil, do we want to jump into the next?
I think what I really appreciate about the framing and the definition that you've opened up is that you're kind of making that move that I've seen over the last several years to connect climate justice to racial justice, and actually to talk about how those are bound up within each other, as opposed to having kind of separate social projects that try to do them separately. So I kind of just really appreciated this idea of moving towards an anti-racist school system is actually part of a climate just response. And so I know you're going to open up more around that, but I just kind of wanted to kind of highlight that piece that was kind of, very highlighted for me as you were kind of opening up your definition. So we are kind of going to pivot now and try to get a little bit more about what this looks like on the ground. We had kind of asked you to share an example or two just to help people see what this looks like in action. So we'll turn things back to you and let you open up a little bit more detail about what it looks like.
Great. Again, I'm keeping this in story form so that you can understand where we're coming from. It's really challenging to paint a good picture without a little bit of a background story. So in my opinion, in climate change education, we're really focusing on addressing three problems that I see, and one of which is scaling down. And you might have heard this in I guess the climate change movement in terms of figuring out how communities take action. But there are a lot of international and national frameworks that speak to climate impacts and solutions, particularly Project Drawdown, you might have heard of. They have a solutions framework that's built on sources and sinks in Earth systems. And it really speaks to global Earth's sources and sinks for carbon or other greenhouse gas emissions. And then there's another framework that's the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And that is another framework that focuses on, I think, 13 different areas on how to move towards sustainability, and climate justice is one of them. And the thing about these big frameworks is that they're very hard to bring to a point that a person or even a city can take action on them, because there is no step-wise process to get from local to global. So this is one thing that we see as our work is trying to fix. Another issue of scale is scaling up. So there's a lot of educators across the United States, and there's not a great support system for teaching and learning about climate change in all of those states. I mean, Washington does a really, really great job financially supporting and having a structure of support for educators and administrators. You all are, I think, the exception to the rule across the country. And so that's one thing, like, how do we scale up these individual efforts coming from my organization to meet educators across the nation? And so one example, might be the Clean Network that's trying to do that. And they're creating a coalition of NGOs or nonprofits to come together and do that work. But oftentimes that's challenging because it's challenging to create good partnerships. And so this is something where we're trying to address this issue too through our partnership process. And the last problem that I see is scaling out. So oftentimes when I ask folks, what are you doing to tackle climate change? They might answer, I recycle or compost or I shop locally, which are all great individual personal actions people can take to reduce their carbon footprint. However, a lot of times folks fail to recognize that we also need to be participating in strategies that are collective, and they challenge the local and national systems or institutions to really changing the processes in which we work in this space. And so that might mean like you should be participating in community organizing, rallies and marches, or electoral strategies. So I wouldn't say this is like individual versus collective. I want to say it's like a yes and. So you should be doing the personal, but you should also be thinking about what is the collective work that you can do. So I want to give you a very specific example of how we are addressing all three of these issues of scale in our work. So when I think about creating teacher professional development at Climate Generation, I think about it as a product of Climate Generation's history at the intersection of climate justice and climate change education, as well as how our organization has responded to the different emerging needs of our educator community. And for the purposes of this talk, I want to talk about our Summer Institute for Climate Change Education. So Climate Generation has been hosting our Summer Institute since 2006. And it's a 3-day conference that brings together educators to learn about climate change education, to practice activities and lessons, and to really get a sense of what this looks like in their educational experiences. And for the first several institutes, the event was hosted in Minnesota, and there were only about 20 to 30, sometimes 50 attendees. So a small, intimate gathering of educators who were dedicated to increasing climate literacy. And at that time, it was really like climate science literacy. And in those days, Climate Generation facilitated that entire institute with 2 to 3 staff and a few invited speakers. And each year, there would be new relevant content that would be featured, inspirational keynotes for the educators. And that was really the model for a long time. And then in spring 2020, when COVID happened and we went on lockdown in response to the pandemic, we and many of our partners had a summer of in-person events planned, and we had to pivot really quickly. And so we got together with a couple of our closest partners, which is NOAA's climate program and the Wild Center's youth climate program. And we brainstormed what would a collaborative virtual institute look like. And after several months of visioning needs assessments and deep conversations about what it means to be in partnership, we decided that a virtual stay institute was the way to go. And we realized that we needed to bring in other leaders in climate change education to help us facilitate multiple regional cohorts. And we believed that having regional cohorts would help us bring that global to local, so localizing our work of climate change to different regions around the country. And so what we did is we partnered with, I think there were 13 different organizations that hosted one aspect of the Institute that year on the impacts and solutions that are seen in their communities. And at the same time that this was happening, the entire country was experiencing a racial reckoning. So in the summer of 2020, George Floyd was murdered on the street right down the road from Climate Generation's office. And his murder caused shock and outrage in our community and all over the country. And it led to peaceful protests demanding racial justice. And at that point in time, Climate Generation wasn't engaging and leading on climate justice advocacy and education through our Youth Environmental Activist Program. And since 2007, that program had been advocating for climate justice at the state and national level, and participating in climate justice education to different degrees. And as our organization was trying to process George Floyd's murder and its resulting impact on us and our work, and really working through that outrage and pain and grief that summer, the youth team's wisdom from that decade of experience and justice really helped us through that process. And it helped me understand what the role is of advocacy and education. And so students shared that they feel climate change very personally because their futures are at stake. And they believe that climate justice advocacy should be highly intersectional. And this is compared to my understanding, I would say, and maybe some of yours, that we're taught about climate change from a really like removed carbon counting perspective, I would say, rather than something that's happening in your life all the time. When I ask folks, especially educators, about the importance of incorporating justice into education, I often get like, well, we do education, we don't really do advocacy. And honestly, before George Floyd happened, before I had all these conversations with my colleagues, I was questioning how much justice is like okay in our education program. And over the course of these conversations, I regularly heard our staff of color saying all of our programming should be centered in justice. And it got me thinking, why don't I feel the same? What's holding me back from like agreeing to that? And over the past several years, I realized that my privilege as a white woman was preventing me from feeling that same sense of urgency around centering justice in our education program. In conversations to plan our first virtual institute, we realized that not only do we need to lean on other organizations to localize the work, but we also need to facilitate diverse collaborative working groups to learn about how organizations are doing this at the intersection of justice and climate change, and how they're currently engaging in climate justice education. Honestly, I didn't have any idea of how to engage in these conversations. I was new to justice-centered organizing and conversations at the time. And I was really wrestling with my own white privilege and grappling with a legacy of like growing up in a family that's skeptical about the justice movement. So what I did, being a scientist, of course, is I did a ton of research. And I read as many articles about integrating justice and diversity as I could. And considering Climate Generation's storytelling background, I also engaged in stories and sought out stories, particularly stories from Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people working and creating solutions for climate change. And like I said, Climate Generation was founded on storytelling, and this work really began to kick off in a program called Talk Climate, which is a 2-day workshop. And I participated at my first Talk Climate the week before I started at Climate Generation. And again, at that time, I was not sold on the idea that stories are powerful motivators for change. But after a few days at this workshop, I found myself crying openly in front of a group of strangers while talking about my experience witnessing climate change impacts on ecological communities. Like I literally broke down. And I realized how much trauma I had been holding onto as a scientist, watching impacts and having no actionable steps to follow on. And at the same time, I realized how powerful that was, me telling that story to inspire connection, empathy, and relationship building. Because after I told my story, people in the audience approached me saying how powerful it was for them to hear it, how my emotions made them remember times when they had felt the same, and how connected they felt to me at that moment of vulnerability. So telling my story actually helped me understand climate change more deeply than any of the reports I had engaged with up to that point. And so one other aspect of this work is that I took that experience from Top Climate and tried to bring it into this cohort model for the Summer Institute, and really hoping that we could move away from transactional work and individuality and into relational collective action. I'm not sure if we're there yet, but we're working on it. And just in a last reflection here is like, it's super hard and challenging to lead on climate justice education. It's challenging breaking out of my personal history as a white scientist. It takes daily effort to shift to community-centered framing and daily commitment to look past my own historical conditioning. And I regularly ask myself if, like, am I doing this right? Should I be leading on this? What does it look like to give up my power and privilege in my work? And I'll say, I mean, I don't have all the answers for sure. We have a model that we're working on, and we're doing it in collaboration with really great people. And one day I hope that we can say we're doing anti-racist climate justice education.
That's awesome, Lindsey. Thank you very much for the share so far.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be great to know more about what your model is for this type of work within the Summer Institute, and dive a little bit deeper into this example.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Deb, and thanks for letting me share my story in this way. So in our 2-year collaboration with these 14 cohort leaders, we've developed a model for the Summer Institute that centers justice and anti-racism as much as we can at this point. And early on, we realized that we needed to move away from climate generation being the primary decision makers and try to decentralize those decisions across the group of cohort leaders. And we realized that also the community of people at the Institute, including climate generation, the cohort leaders, the presenters, and the educators, all needed avenues for input into this framework. So once we shifted our mindset of like, okay, this is not an event that's put on by one organization, this is an event that's created in community, the work became really different, and the output became really different. And at the current moment, we're working toward incorporating voice, everyone's voice, in 4 ways at the Institute. And these are the 4 dimensions: people, culture, content, and processes. And I'm going to go through these somewhat quickly. I give very concrete examples of how we do this in each one of them, but for the audience, if there's anything that stands out to you that you want me to explain more, please write it down and ask a question about that, because I'm happy to share out exactly how we do that work. So I'll start with people. You probably heard representation matters, but representation isn't everything. It's really important to support diverse identities and voice and power at every level of decision making in your work. And for us, this looks like our planning partners and advisors, the presenters, the volunteer and staff, and the attendees. So really thinking about how we can create a really diverse community that raises up the experience and expertise of everyone. And we do this through very specific cultural practices. So if you don't have a culture or an organization that values voice from everyone, you're not going to have a place for everyone to show up. So we try to create a culture of co-mentorship and transparency and learning. And we do this in a lot of different ways. One of them is simply identifying pronouns and asking folks to do that all the time. A little bit more in-depth example of how we do that is we create racial affinity spaces where folks can pursue what it means to be anti-racist or what it means to center justice in this work from their own racial identity. And another relatively simple thing is that at these workshops, we always facilitate interactivity and engagement. And we train our presenters to do this work in a very specific way. And processes, so this is getting like behind the scenes a little bit in the Institute. We realize that we can't have equitable participation if we're not paying folks equitably, if we're not asking folks what they need to fully participate and to bring themselves to the work. And so what we do is we facilitate listening calls with every single person. I guess not every person at the Institute, but we talk to every presenter. We talk to probably 70% of the attendees, and we talk to all of the cohort leaders, and we ask them to provide input on what it means to be included in our event. What do they need to participate and show up? And we integrate that into the framework. And we also take what those different audiences are telling us, and we share it with the other groups and say like, oh, and educators are saying they need this to show up. We take that to the cohort leaders and the presenters and vice versa. So really facilitating this sense of, even though folks don't have direct access to one another, facilitating a sense of transparency. And the last thing we do, which is not the least important, but I believe that you can't really have great content unless you have all of these other working pieces as well. But we try to feature content that's interdisciplinary, that's rooted in justice, and is geared towards supporting an anti-racist educational experience. So this is like thinking about specific pedagogies, like culturally sustaining pedagogies, culturally responsive pedagogies, phenomena-centered teaching and learning, and then student-driven action and place-based learning opportunities. And we have themes and workshops that are created in community, so that the cohort leaders come together and develop those out. And then we send specific invitations to folks who we think can fill those spaces and tell us about that work. And then we also have preparatory toolkits for educators who are coming to this brand new. So some folks who don't know a lot about climate change, or like maybe the foundations in climate science, they might get a little hesitant about like coming into this justice space because they're like, oh, I don't even know about the science. So we do have a toolkit for them to engage in beforehand to help them feel a little bit more comfortable with these conversations, I would say.
Go ahead, Phil.
I was just, I love people that build tools for other people and that make them available. So thank you so much for that work. I guess I'm just so many different layers that I kind of am interested in and want to hear more about. And I think, Deb's going to take us in a particular direction next, but I just wanted to lift up the piece of the personal journey that you were sharing. And thank you for sharing that piece. Kind of as a white educator, white scholar coming into a space, I was really resonating to that daily work and the kind of the, being very receptive to knowing your position and role within the work and hearing from others that you're working with about what that might be. And so I just kind of wanted to kind of really kind of lift up that piece. It reminded me, there's a kind of a new line of scholarship in Indigenous studies from Holly Calago, where she's kind of opening up this concept of like critical settler consciousness. Like, what is it that settlers need to understand about history in relation to the environment, in relation to Indigenous sovereignty? And so I was kind of riffing off of that concept, thinking about white settler consciousness that might be kind of parallel to kind of some of what I hear you kind of naming as that daily work. I wonder if you could say a bit about like, where do you turn to learn to do that work? Like, what are your sources that support you in that daily equity journey?
Yeah. Well, one is Climate Generation staff. We have an incredibly dedicated group of people that pursue this work personally and individually all the time. And we have a shared common space called, like, y'all are using Slack. We use Slack as well. And so one thing I do look to my staff, or our staff, to see what are they reading, what are they engaging with, how are they challenging themselves? Because I mean, frankly, they have a lot of experience in this space that I don't already have. So I always look to them as mentors. Some things that I have engaged with, and I might not remember the exact names of things, but we can maybe share them after. There are a lot of prompts and resources for folks to think about white privilege and how it shows up every day. And when I was first starting this journey, that was really helpful for me because I didn't really understand what privilege was. I mean, I knew I had privilege. I wasn't a person that was like, oh, you know, I've struggled my life and I'm not privileged. But I didn't understand how it manifests itself unconsciously in a lot of ways. And like, so this idea that, you know, how like educators might identify as being type A, I would say like I'm a type A person and I like to do things really well. But one thing is like seeking perfection is really a white supremacist characteristic. And that, you know, like really digging into like, what is the white supremacy and how does it show up in the workplace as well? So like one, what is white privilege? Two, how does it show up in the workplace? And then like really reflecting on like what work behavior are you putting out there in the world that's white culture. And when all of that comes together, you start to realize like sometimes these like practices that we're holding on to as like a way we do really good work is actually a cultural thing. And that when I started realizing that, I feel like I got a lot of freedom to start being more creative and allowing people to have power in a way that I wasn't before, because I thought it was my responsibility to have that power. And I can probably quickly, I didn't before this I don't know why, but there's two particular resources that I'm thinking about. And Deb, I know you know the invisible knapsack.
Yeah. Yeah, the other one I use is something called the White Accomplice.
Yeah.
That's a great one. I can find it.
Yeah. And then the other one is there's if we just look up like how white supremacy shows up in the workplace, and I can find it, but those two have been really useful for me to reflect. And again, the second part of that, Phil, sorry, this is like a long answer, but the second part of that is starting to live in the discomfort of understanding the things you're doing wrong and that it's okay to be wrong as long as you're moving into space of trying to do things right. It starts to get scary when you start to look at your privilege, and like it gets cringy because you're like, oh my gosh, all the things I've said over the course of my life. And, you know, living in that discomfort and saying, okay, that, you know, that's fine. That's where I was at the time. I can move on from that and look for resources to do things better. And one of those things is like just practicing in these conversations and like coming to that space and as being real who you are and telling your story like I have, which is always really powerful for people to hear. So, yeah.
Yeah, I put a couple of my resources that I think are sort of the top of the bin resources around that. And we have some of the other ones in our STEM teaching tools related to conversations on race and racism and science learning and learning context more generally. So yeah, for sure. The All We Can Save resources that Brad put in there are also extremely helpful.
Yep.
And that's more of a Black feminist and like multi-racial and multi-ethnic kind of feminist lens, which is really lovely. So as we kind of pivot in thinking about how educators do take this up, not, you know, on a like multi-pronged level, all of these different components, is there specific guidance that you have for folks working the first time? You know, we've named one of the ones around just issues of whiteness and white supremacy and having those conversations. Are there other things that you would highlight?
Yeah. And again, because I don't know everyone's specific context, so I've kind of thought about maybe three main ways that I would suggest you tackle this issue. Is one of the big things is realizing that relationships matter and trust matters in this work. So not only are you trusted messengers to your students, but also having trusting relationships among yourself and the folks in your professional learning network. It's really important, especially if you want to start to diversify that learning network a little bit. And really like centering on this idea that the work should be relational and not transactional, and thinking about the time it takes and the vulnerability and commitment from everyone in that work. So, I mean, typically what I would suggest is like finding a community that's doing work that you look up to and you aspire to, and watching them and listening to them and observing what their practices are and decentering what you think should be happening. And this is something that I started doing. Like I would go to climate advocacy labs resources, and they're really centered on like the social justice movement. But if you watch how they facilitate their spaces, it is like transformative from the way that an educator might do the same thing. And so really looking at how do they bring in and welcome people's intersectional identities in that space, how they find time in these meetings to have everyone talk, you know, those different things. And just watching how other people do the work was really been valuable for me, and it's something I would suggest you do. There's a lot of different networks you can join. I mean, Climate Generation has our Teach Climate Network, which is the professional learning network. And we have monthly workshops from different speakers, not just Climate Generation staff. And we also host the Summer Institute. So, I mean, those are pretty basic ways that you can get access to folks that are maybe not in education specifically, because our work, we have social justice organizers come, we have scientists come, we have educators come, and we have people like psychologists come and talk about social emotional learning, trauma-informed teaching. And we also have a somatics movement instructor and a dance instructor that's coming to, like, you know, showcase all the different facilitation techniques really that could be used to do this work. Yeah, and there are some other groups too that have curriculum or do curriculum coaching style work. We do a little bit of that, but 10 Strands and EcoRise, 10 Strands is in California and EcoRise is in Texas, and really works. They're a network, like a broad network across the country. But both of them are working on curriculum and then the professional development that goes along with it. So I think this work is really hard to do alone, I would say. And if you can't find anyone at your school or at your place to do the work with you, I would suggest finding a virtual network of some kind.
I have a question from the chat that might fit in right about here. So somebody says it's really powerful. Thank you for sharing. Can you share an example of integrating climate and social justice in a particular topic or unit? Is there a particular one that comes to mind for you that kind of you want to lift up as an example of that integration?
Sure. Can I stop screen sharing? I feel like that would be useful.
Sure.
Yes. So let me think. Which one? I feel like there's a lot of different ways we could do this. So if you have a phenology unit, so studying nature's responses to climate, so like seasonal shifts, if you're in ecology, you would do this probably, or environmental sciences. There's really easy ways to integrate other ways of knowing in that space and in that work. So oftentimes when folks think about what are observations and data that tell us about climate change is happening, we think Western science, right? But we could really be thinking about other ways, like I'm sure you're familiar with traditional ecological knowledge, but there's also, there's some work out of different organizations that do species vulnerability assessments. So using, and coming from an Indigenous perspective, using Indigenous stories from Indigenous elders and using language, Indigenous language, to understand the relationship between animals, plants, and the land, and thinking about how that language has described these historical patterns of that relationship and how those relationships are being pushed outside of the bounds of that language. And I'm probably not doing it justice in terms of describing it. And Phil probably knows more about this than I do, but that's like where my brain sort of goes. I can actually probably pop a resource in here that's really amazing from Glyphwick. The other thing I'm thinking about, is renewable energies. If you're doing a unit on any type of electricity or solar, you may just have a unit on solar. So there are a lot of Indigenous communities, or specifically one in my mind, Solar Bear is the organization that is doing solar electrification work for Indigenous communities. And they're actually creating incredibly innovative, like I would say, very supportive of democracy-led electrification that could inspire the rest of the country to be like creating a very nimble and adaptable way that we all get energy. So creating flexible microgrids and decentralizing the power structure, or like electric power structure, right? And so what you can do in these units where you're looking at our existing systems of how we live, like getting water and electricity, like you can actually look at what are the other ways we could be doing this that are more central to like where we want to be, not what we're doing. Teach to the solution, not to how it is right now. And that really lifts up the power and work of frontline communities in particular, because so folks in frontline communities are living at the intersection of justice issues and climate change, and they're creating incredibly innovative solutions that we could all learn from. So that's where I like to start with that.
Awesome. Yeah, I just know that like in the context of like quickly trying to develop renewable energy responses, that's often done in ways that are unjust to Indigenous communities, lands, and rights and territories. And so like that example you're lifting up is like a way of doing that in a consensual way, like in right relation, so that there's actually those relationships that are developing and in place that allow that to be done in that local kind of more decentralized, electrical way. So that's great. That's I think a great set of different examples. You've been sharing so many resources with us today. I don't know if there are others that you'd like to lift up as we go to close out the hour here, but I will throw the mic back to you to see if, in case there is something else that you just want people to know about for sure. And I want to lift up all the examples that colleagues on the chat are also sharing today, and we'll bundle those up in our show notes.
Yeah, if I leave with anything, I would say there are so many amazing resources out there in the world that I always come, I feel like, with the baskets and just like handing goodies out, One thing that we haven't talked about is how, I kind of touched on it, but like how green careers are movers for change. So when we think about creating solutions for climate change, of course, we don't want to only think about like market-based solutions, but that's sort of the reality that we live in. And for us to move into the green economy, we need to have industry that can support that work. So if we want to be fully sustained on like electric vehicles, we need people that can like get us there. And we need to train our folks, like young folks, to get into that space. And, honestly, career work starts really, really young. It's actually lifelong learning, but being prepared to go into a career, especially a new industry, requires starting super young. Like I would say like middle school, where folks are identifying what skills they need and what problems they want to solve in the world. And then they have enough time to develop the pathway to that career. And so Climate Generation has this curriculum that supports the development of inspiring students and educators to teach about green careers through middle school and beyond. So I just wanted to share that with you. And I mean, I know at first, like I was like, how it feels weird to be teaching like folks about careers so young, but it's actually a justice solution as well. So one aspect of career work is teaching like how do people make a living wage that solves problems in their lives and sustains their family. And a lot of times jobs aren't equally available across all social identities. And so we really want to think about like, how do we create an equitable platform to move into a career that can pay enough for your life? So that's something that's in here too.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so, certainly there's the shorter time scale of understanding that we're kind of complicit inside of market structures and worlds. And yet, even if we want to be moving towards a more degrowth economy or like a restructured economy longer term, like maybe those are parallel things that need to happen at once.
Yeah.
So that's fabulous. We want to thank everyone for joining us today. We're going to go to wrap up. Lindsey, thank you so much for sharing all the inspirational work of you and your colleagues and your collaborators and your other organizations that you've partnered with. I think it really is this model of kind of radical collaboration towards justice, understanding that people enter into that work in different places and like need to find their way on in that daily journey kind of way that you were lifting up for us. So I kind of really am just like struck and inspired by all the work that Climate Gen is doing with its partners. So thank you.
Thanks. I appreciate that, Phil.
And I want to add my thanks to that, Lindsey, for being here today and for the long time collaboration and partnership. Just deeply appreciate your work in the world and all of the folks involved quite extensively now in climate generation work. So thank you for your approach and for the examples you put out into the world like that. We do have a recording of this discussion that will be posted on the climate learning section of the STEMteachingtools.org site, where we're clustering our climate resources. Resources and papers will be linked in the notes for the video. So all of the resources that people have thrown in here and that we are, have named in this work, we'll make sure they get clustered and put onto that. And a big thank you to all of those who are working in the background.
I specifically want to thank Corey Shee and Abby Reinhardt for their kind of tech and organizational support, but behind the scenes of the webinar. We're excited. We've kind of planned out the next several months of monthly webinars. Please join us next month on May 13th from 11 to noon Pacific, when Tim Swinehart will be joining us. Tim's an environmental justice educator, quite familiar on the scene. Currently teaches geography and environmental justice at Lincoln High School and also teaches at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. He was co-editor of A People's Curriculum for the Earth, came out from the ZenEd Foundation. So he's also a founding member of the Portland Public Schools Climate Justice Committee back in 2016 and since. So we're excited for that, and we have other things in store. And so, yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. Take good care.
Have a great day, everyone.